Welcome to Discover Health, a White Mountain perspective. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Barella. Thank you for joining us today, and I think we have a very interesting program, a program actually that affects all of us in our daily lives every day. We're going to talk about food, and we're going to talk about how the county ensures that our food supply is safe, not only from a standpoint in restaurants, but also in our grocers. And to do this, our guest today is Kathryn Mathewson, and she is, I'm going to read this because I don't want to get in trouble. She is the Environmental Health Program Manager for Navajo County.
Yes.
Is that correct? And I would say welcome to you this morning, Kathryn. And we are going to have a little bit of fun because, as I mentioned in our conversation before we started the taping, you are probably, and your cohorts are probably the most important people in the county for ensuring that our health is safe.
Yes, and thank you for having me. So yes.
Your role touches everybody in the county.
Yes, that's correct. We are the hidden treasures. We are the people that people don't realize we're there. And when we are there, they don't always like us to be there, especially establishments. So it's actually true. You're kind of hidden from the public eye. I guess the only thing we know that you're there is every once in a while we see those inspection stickers that places, at least I've seen those in restaurants that I've been at, that the A, B's, and C. And we'll talk about the A, B's, and C's. Okay. And I don't even know if you use that up here. We don't. Actually, the state doesn't require that to be displayed. Okay. You'll see that a lot in California.
And you see it a lot in Phoenix. I've noticed that in restaurants in Phoenix that they'll proudly display their only their A's and stuff like that.
Yes.
So tell me, you have environmental health. So what is the definition for us in the public of environmental health? What do you do?
Environmental health encompasses a lot of different things. It can encompass anywhere from the air to the food to even sewage. I have done septic installations where I've seen them go in, and I've also seen where septics are in really bad shape too. We do hotels and swimming pools. We are kind of everywhere.
Kind of. So, I mean, when we started our conversation planning for this morning, I really just focused on the food supply. Mm-hmm. But your department does those kinds of things too?
We don't do the septic at this point, but we're trained for everything. So when we take the RS exam, the Registered Sanitarian exam, we're required to know air, food, septic, so many different things. There's so many chemicals, material safety data sheets. We're required to know all of that just to be able to pass the Registered Sanitarian exam. So,
that was one of the questions I had for you. I mean, what is the background necessary for people like you to do the job you do?
So my background is I worked in the restaurant business for most of my life. In 2001, I became an environmental sanitarian aide. And when I became the sanitarian aide, I was basically given the code, and they said, here, you need to read this, and then go out and do inspections. So
you did.
So I did that, and that was back in 2001. 2003, I passed my Registered Sanitarian exam. I needed at least 30 credit hours of science and some background in inspecting before I could actually sit for the exam.
Okay, so it's a regular degree type program.
Yes. So wow. Maricopa County requires you have a bachelor's degree before you can even work at Maricopa.
All right.
So
and you came here from, you were saying, La Paz?
I came from La Paz County, and that's where I first started in 01. In 07, I went to Maricopa County. So I worked in Maricopa County for about 5 years. And then from there, I went to the state of Arizona, to Arizona Department of Health Services. And then from there, I went back to La Paz. and now I'm here.
You're here.
Yeah.
Well, you've certainly been around and certainly have a lot of qualifications. I'll bet you have a lot of stories that you would probably, people would like to hear and probably wouldn't. So knowing that, no.
No.
That's probably an honest answer. So let's kind of start. What does a food inspector do?
So a food inspector, we go in and we kind of take a snapshot. So it's like we're going in and taking a snapshot of the establishment to see what is going on. We're only usually there anywhere from 2 to 4 times a year. So really, out of the 365 days of the year, we're only taking a snapshot. So we're just seeing what's going on. A restaurant, when I go in, the first thing I do is I wash my hands. That's the first thing. And it shows an example. It shows 3 things. One, it tells everybody that I'm going to wash my hands. I'm doing what I'm supposed to. I check for hot water, and then from there, then I look around. I'm observing what's going on in the establishment so I can see, where I need to go. Depending on the establishment, it's going to tell me where I want to go. If they're cooking, I'm going to go to the cook line. If they're basically slow, then I'm going to go to the back of the house and do this, what we call static, or stationary, things that don't change very much, like the walk-in and the refrigerators, and check and verify that they're within the temperature parameters. So, and then from there, we're watching to make sure they don't have bare hand contact, because they don't want to have anything from their hands get onto people's food. And then checking cooking temperatures. So we do a lot of different things when we go in there.
That's really interesting. Are people supposed to wash their hands before they start working every day?
Absolutely, in the restaurant business, yes.
In the restaurant business. So I guess the first question anybody like me would ask is, are your visits announced?
No, they're not.
So they're all surprised.
They're all surprised. They never know when I'm going to show up. When you call in and schedule an inspection, they go and start immediately cleaning up. They start date marking things. So we want to go in when they're not expecting us. So
it's always a surprise.
It's always a surprise.
So we see, a lot of us people that aren't in the restaurant business, we see things on TV where people are cooking with their hands and their fingers, and they show these long lines in restaurants of people making salads with their fingers, and then you see in other ones where people are gloved. Are there particular criteria for those two activities and requirements for touching with your hands versus?
So yes, it just depends on what they're actually doing. If they're handling ready-to-eat food, so ready-to-eat food is anything that you can pick up and eat. They're required in the state of Arizona to use gloves, non-latex gloves. But if they're like washing vegetables, things like that, they don't need to wear gloves. Or if they're handling like raw meat, but they would need to wash their hands and put gloves on when they switch to do
a ready to eat type of stuff. And there must be and that actually is an interesting thing, because there was a cooking show a few years ago where a cook did not change the cutting board, switching from meat to ready to eat foods, and he chop the food up on the same board and stuff like that. I guess that's a no-no.
It's a big no-no. So it's cross-contamination, which would be, whatever that bacteria, salmonella. You could have salmonella. There's another one.
E. coli.
Yes, E. coli.
We'll talk about E. coli 0157 as contaminating the meat in Seattle years and years. I guess that started one of the big national concerns years ago, was the hamburger meat in somewhere.
It was in the 80s, and it was in, I think it was Washington, but I could be wrong.
Well, Seattle.
Yeah, Seattle, Washington. So
I was.
It was a jack. Well, never mind.
Well, it's an interesting, for me as a physician. People worry about getting food poisoning all the time. They call in the evening with somebody vomiting from something during the daytime, so you always end up, and then of course when the TV says we've got an epidemic, everybody of course naturally says, I have that particular thing. So what you do to prevent those telephone calls to me is really very important. So you go in there essentially unannounced, and what is and you look at the static part, and that is storage, or that's not involved with food preparation? Not
always, but there might be cooling going on in the walk-ins. So that's a very important part, is making sure the food's cooled properly. If it's not cooled properly, you could have a whole bunch of different organisms growing as well. With your starchy foods, you would have like
Clostridia perfringens.
Yes, C. perfringens.
I got all the technical names and pronunciation down.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to make sure I'm telling you the right ones.
Yeah,
so.
That's okay. But I mean, so basically, that's part of it too.
Yeah, we don't want to make people sick. So watching the cooling, making sure they're cooling it down from 140 down to 70 in 2 hours, and then from 70 down to 41 in 4. So getting that right there is going to prevent people from getting sick. Making sure walk-ins are at the right temperature is important too.
So you have to cool food correctly too?
Yes.
I mean, warm them up. I'm sorry, not cool, but cool and warm them up correctly?
So yes, if let's say that somebody cooks a whole bunch of turkeys and they put them in the walk-in, you want to make sure those turkeys are cut down properly so that they can cool down fast. You want to have them in shallow containers, metals preferred, and then uncovered, because all your raw meats are going to be on the bottom shelf. So you won't have the contamination of raw meat dripping down into your ready-to-eat foods. So... And then once it reaches temperature, then they can cover it at that point.
You know, storage, like you just described, raw meats below cooked meats and stuff like that, must be a big problem for restaurants. Because when you read the reports in the Arizona Republic about failures, a lot of times you read that it's improper storage in refrigerators.
Yes.
And it always is. It doesn't always, but it seems like frequently it's this food is stored above this food.
Yes.
And why is that so important? I mean, why is raw meat below or above? I mean, bacteria don't fly.
They don't fly, but they drip. So
good point. All right.
So if they don't put the meat in a container that will prevent spillage, or even if they put it in a shallow container when they're thawing the raw meats, if that raw meat juice should spill onto your lettuce or to your tomatoes, that's not going to be cooked again, then you could have potential bacterial contamination.
Never thought of that. That's why you're here, because I never thought of. Because I'm sure people do that in their refrigerator. I know a lot of times I don't even think about that when I put things away after cooking in the refrigerator. And in refrigerator, at least home refrigerators, the vegetable bin is always on the bottom.
Yes, that is correct. So a lot of times, like I know my parents, they will put their raw meat in a container so that it doesn't drip onto their produce. Plus you have in your personal refrigerators, you have shelving that will prevent some of the
shelving over
contamination. So, but a lot of times in the restaurants, what they have is they'll have, slats. Because you want to have it cool, you want the air to flow.
Circulate, yeah.
And circulate. So a lot of times they're like, they're slats.
Or wire shelving.
Wire shelving
and stuff like that.
Yes.
Well, interesting thought process. and I guess is it important when you thaw meat, like frozen meat, it has to be thawed in the refrigerator versus thawed out on a countertop?
Correct. So
why?
Because bacteria can grow, and you leave it out on your counters for so long, because it takes a long time to thaw. So it's just like taking your turkey during Thanksgiving and putting it in your refrigerator 5 days prior. So you want to allow it to thaw properly and not allow it to grow bacteria. Because a lot of times once the bacteria is there, it's harder to kill.
It would seem to make sense, because the surface of whatever meat it is warm to room temperature, and that all that time it's thawing at room temperature, those bacteria on the surface would begin to grow.
Right.
And then it's really important that you cook it right. So let's go to the second half of that, the cooking line.
Okay.
So what do you look for in the cooking line?
So in the cooking line, I make sure that one, they're handling the product correctly. So they're changing gloves when they need to, when they change tasks, putting raw meat onto the grill, and then they will have to change gloves and wash hands when they want to, start making the burger, the lettuce, tomato, and
other stuff
on the other stuff. So that's the first thing I look for. And then the next thing I look for is the cooking, making sure that they're cooking it to the proper temperature.
So you have one of those thermometers?
I do. So, and having the right tools is always important. So a lot of times when I see them not have ones that are really fast, like I like the thermometers, then I suggest to them, but it's not a requirement. As long as they have a thermometer that they can check the cooking temperature, it's fine. It just might take them a little bit.
Do restaurants check cooking temperatures?
The good ones do.
The good ones do. I mean, if you go to a restaurant, you order rare meat or medium rare or medium, do they actually check it with a thermometer?
When I'm there, they do.
That is real good. Well, because you go to restaurants a lot of times and you order something medium or medium rare, and it comes out well.
Yeah.
And so
it depends on what the item is, and it depends on a whole bunch of different criteria for cooking raw, cooking it not to the proper temperature. A lot of times, if it's like a whole intact beef steak, it can be cooked to a lower temperature. But your ground meats, whenever it's ground, you're taking the bacteria from the outside and putting it into the middle of that meat. So you're going to have more bacteria everywhere in that patty.
And maybe that's the reason why we have the requirements that ground beef has to be cooked well. They can't do it in medium rare. Great point. I never thought of that.
And the other thing that you really want to be aware of too is with your kids, you want to make sure that the meat, especially the hamburgers, are cooked to the right temperature for kids, because you do have that E. coli 157, and that it will cause some really bad symptoms for little guys. So
what is a safe temperature for cooking meat?
Depends on the meat.
Okay, well.
So ground beef is 155.
Okay.
I have a little funny saying that I say about chicken. I say chicken is the foulest thing on the planet. You cook it to the highest temperature is 165.
165.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
and if you get fried chicken, that's almost always over 165 on the surface. And do you have to worry about the internal temperature?
Yes, you do, because there's still salmonella in there. So you want to take the temperature in the actual meat, and you want to probe it. You don't want to just take a surface temperature. Yeah.
Okay. So those digital thermometers that do it very rapidly are the types of things that you recommend, even for those of us in the home situation, to make sure that the meat is cooked correctly.
At home, I have the old school dial thermometers, and when I cook chicken or anything like that, I check my temperature before I serve it to my kids.
Well, I have one of those digital ones, those nice fold-out digital ones that I use. And my wife uses it because she knows that I would butcher the meat if I tried to cook it. But that's a very good point, and in terms of cooking, and I don't think a lot of people recognize the issue with ground beef and making sure that ground beef is cooked correctly, because you're essentially mixing fat and stuff into the middle of it. While if you cook, for example, a chicken breast or a turkey breast, that is really a solid piece of meat and stuff like that. So anything that's ground needs to be made sure that it's cooked correctly.
Or injected. So a lot of times they'll inject meat too, so then you would cook it to a higher temperature because you're taking the bacteria from the outside, injecting it into the meat itself. So
good point. I mean, like stuffed pork chops and stuff like that.
Right. Or even like if you do your own chicken fried steak, so you're pounding the steak, and you're allowing bacteria to go into the into the meat, so you have to cook it to a higher temperature.
Fortunately, they mostly, well, I don't know how they cook
They're
chicken
mostly are
fried
fried.
steak. Yeah. Okay.
Mostly.
Well, what great thoughts. I mean, I never even thought about those kinds of things. And I assume that good restaurants have a cooking line where somebody does the meats and then somebody does the produce type pieces of it, so they don't cross each other and have to keep gloving up and changing?
Yes, that's correct. The good ones do. So,
do most restaurants? But
it depends on the restaurant. I mean, I've seen really good restaurants where they have one cook, and that cook is very aware of what they're doing and how they're doing it. It just depends on the person too, and how willing they are to, do what they're supposed to do, and how nervous they are. So.
Impressive. You never think about. And how about grocery stores? Is it the same thought process in food storage and grocery stores? I mean, you don't have to worry about the line item. It's all static, isn't it?
Pretty much, except for the delis.
Except for the delis, and then the delis are held to the same criteria as restaurants and stuff like that. And you do those inspections randomly too?
Yes.
Do the big restaurant chains have their own inspectors that go through there that kind of make sure that when you get there, everything is already okay?
Yes, most of the big chains will have internal audits that they do.
And stuff like that. And so they don't fail very often.
No, they don't.
They don't fail very. Mostly a restaurant issue?
It's mostly, I've seen where it's mom and pop, and I've seen chain too. They are not always up to par. It just depends on the establishment.
Okay, and grading of the restaurants. Do we do that in our county?
We do.
Or is it just a pass-fail system?
It's the grading system is really interesting. Back in 2001, when they changed the food code, it went from a numerical to a different system, which is E is excellent. They're excellent. There's no critical violations while I'm there. They might have some floor wall ceilings, but we don't consider floor walls and ceilings a critical. It's a non-critical item in the food code. Satisfactory means that they have critical violations, but they're able to correct them while I'm there. So like eggs over lettuce, if I ask them, hey, move the eggs down to the bottom shelf because you could potentially contaminate the lettuce, they're fixing it while I'm there.
Yolk.
Yeah. So
I learned that from what you were talking about. Okay.
So then there's needs improvement, and needs improvement means that they have critical violations, but they can't fix it while I'm there. Examples would be like they have a refrigerator out, or they've got pests. So, and then that constitutes a reinspection, and we would come back depending on what we've given them the timeline. So it just depends on what it is and the severity of it.
Okay, so there's a whole series.
So there's 4 of them. So there's excellent, satisfactory, needs improvement, and then there's unacceptable.
So what is the circumstances where you'd actually say your doors are closed?
So the door is closed. There's several different criteria in the food code. 1 is if they've had a fire. 2 is if they've got sewage coming up.
And good thing you know about sewage.
So no power, no water, or if it's so gross that we're like, you need to shut down just to clean. So
like rats running on the countertop and stuff like that, which I know you've never seen, but
oh no.
Well, I mean, that's obviously an exaggeration, but I suspect there are conditions where that are very severe.
Yeah.
And you give them a day or 2 to get their act together, and if they can't.
Yeah.
And I suspect that doesn't happen very often.
No, it doesn't. Fortunately for me, because then you have to figure out what you're going to do and what the criteria is in the code. So that's something that is not, it's in the code, but it's really hard to get people to understand. I've had where, in the Phoenix area when I was down there, they had like little roaches all the way up to the big ones all over during the day while I was there. And it's like, okay, reinspection, you gotta, we're gonna come back. And it's really hard to shut a restaurant down, but at the same time, there's certain criteria that we would have to close them down.
Well, it seems like an exterminator would be helpful
Exactly.
under that particular circumstance.
Yeah.
But how often do you come across where restaurant owners just really don't know that was part of the code? I suspect there are things that are kind of hidden in the code that people say, well, I didn't realize that. Just like the person who's sitting across from you right now says, I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting.
A lot of times they're going to have the active managerial control, so they're aware of the food code. They know what they're supposed to do. A lot of times things happen. People, things happen in your life that it affects you. And I've seen where it affects people that they're like, oh, I remember, but I forgot, And it's just like...
I suspect that's the main cause, isn't it?
Yeah.
I got busy today and I put the eggs above the lettuce and stuff like that and stuff like that. I suspect that most people are really pretty conscientious because nobody wants their restaurant closed because somebody got sick from an epidemic in their restaurant.
That is correct. So definitely nobody wants to be closed for that reason.
So if you were going to open a restaurant, is there a service that the state has to inspect you and show you about how to run your restaurant, or do you really just have to hire a commercial guy to come in there and make sure your restaurant's ready to open?
So for new establishments, we will go and help them and kind of identify what they need to do to open them up. So it just all depends on the establishment and what they're doing too. A sandwich shop is different than a, full-on scale restaurant.
And I learned things I never even thought of in terms of what you gave us today. And I got to admit, your role is incredibly important. So those of you that are eating out and buying food, which is all of us, learn a little bit today that there's somebody in the background in our county health department that's watching over all of us. And Kathryn, I would thank you very much for taking time out of your inspecting day to come for this discussion. And eat healthy and know that there's somebody out there watching for us. Thank you.